So this man was a devoted father of three, a hardworking accountant, and a seemingly respectable husband. But one day, without warning, he murdered his entire family. His wife, his mother, his children. Every single one of them. Why? Because he was drowning in debt. Because he was too ashamed to admit failure. Because he convinced himself that death was the only way to save their souls. Hold on. Let me tell you the story. John List wasn't just any killer. He was a man who meticulously planned the annihilation of his own family. He wrote letters, made financial arrangements, and even ensured that his own face would disappear from every family photo, making it harder for authorities to track him down. And after executing his plan with terrifying precision, he simply vanished. For 18 years, he lived a brand new life, undetected, as if his past had never existed. But justice has a way of catching up, and when it finally did, the world was left horrified by the details of what he had done. This is the shocking story of John List, the man who erased his family and disappeared into thin air. But before we dive into the crime itself, let's take a step back. Who was John List, really? And what pushed him to commit one of the most infamous family murders in American history? Before John List became the man who coldly executed his own family, he was just a boy growing up in a strict, deeply religious household. Born on September 17, 1925 in Bay City, Michigan, John Emil List was raised in a devout Lutheran family. His father, John Frederick List, was an austere and controlling man, someone who believed in discipline, hard work, and unwavering faith in God. His mother, Alma, was equally strict, if not more so, and her influence over young John would shape his future in ways no one could have predicted. John was an only child, and his parents ensured that he lived a sheltered and isolated life. There were no siblings to play with, no roughhousing with friends, just an existence centered around religion, academics, and obedience. Alma, in particular, was overbearing. She monitored everything John did, ensuring that he followed the rigid moral path she believed in. She instilled in him an unwavering fear of failure, and the idea that any deviation from religious and societal expectations was unacceptable. To Alma, appearances mattered above all else, and her son was to be nothing short of perfect. This strict upbringing left John socially awkward and introverted. He excelled in school, but he was never the popular or outgoing type. He had no choice but to meet the expectations set upon him, excelling academically and embracing the Lutheran faith with the same intensity as his parents. Religion became a cornerstone of his identity, not just as a belief system, but as an unshakable structure that dictated his actions and moral compass. However, this moral compass would eventually lead him down a dark and twisted path, one where he believed he had the divine right to decide the fate of his own family. As he grew older, John's dedication to academics led him to pursue a career in accounting. Numbers were straightforward, logical, and structured, something he could control, unlike the uncertainties of human relationships. He attended the University of Michigan, earning a degree in business administration and later serving in the U.S. Army during World War II. His military service was brief but significant. He worked as a lab technician, and while he never saw combat, the experience reinforced his disciplined and structured mindset. After the war, John resumed his education and built a stable, respectable career as an accountant. He met his future wife, Helen, in 1951. Helen was a widow with a young daughter, and their relationship moved quickly. John, raised in a household where family duty was paramount, saw marriage as an obligation rather than a romantic pursuit. Helen, on the other hand, was determined to secure a stable husband, and John was the perfect candidate. Responsible, religious, and financially stable. They married, and John adopted Helen's daughter, Brenda, before the couple went on to have 3 children of their own: Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. From the outside, they were the perfect suburban family, but beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. Helen was not the traditional, devout wife that John had envisioned. She had a drinking problem and suffered from syphilis, a condition she had contracted from her late first husband. Over time, this led to severe health complications, causing frequent tension in their marriage. Helen's sharp tongue and criticisms clashed with John's rigid, structured mindset. He was not a man who adapted well to disorder, and Helen's deteriorating health and erratic behavior became a source of deep frustration for him. Despite their marital troubles, John remained committed to his role as the head of the family. Divorce was unthinkable in his religious world. And failure, whether in marriage, career, or life, was something he could not accept. But as financial troubles started creeping in, the pressure mounted. The illusion of control he had built over the years was beginning to slip through his fingers. The man who had spent his entire life trying to live up to impossible expectations was now on the verge of collapse. And when that collapse finally came, it would take his entire family down with him. But before we get to that horrific day, let's take a closer look at the pressures that led John List to the breaking point. By the early 1970s, the foundation of John List's carefully structured life was crumbling. The man who had spent his entire existence following the rules, working hard, upholding his faith, and presenting the image of the perfect family, was now drowning in a situation that he could neither control nor accept. It all began with his career. John, a meticulous accountant, had prided himself on his ability to provide for his family, but a series of professional setbacks left him struggling to maintain his once stable financial standing. After losing his prestigious job at a bank due to corporate downsizing, John struggled to find steady work. He took on smaller accounting jobs, but they paid far less than he was accustomed to, and his pride kept him from revealing the depth of his financial distress. In his mind, admitting failure was worse than suffering in silence. Instead of seeking help, John chose to maintain the illusion of success. Each morning, he dressed in his suit, carried his briefcase, and left the house as if heading to work. In reality, he spent hours at the train station or wandering aimlessly, too ashamed to let his family know he had become unemployed. But unemployment was just one part of the problem. The mortgage on the Grand Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, their so-called dream home, was becoming impossible to maintain. The house, inherited from John's mother, Alma, was as much a symbol of his success as it was a financial burden. The heating bills alone were astronomical, and with no steady income, the debt piled up. Creditors began calling, and John, a man who had spent his life following the path of financial responsibility, found himself trapped in a nightmare of unpaid bills and looming bankruptcy. Meanwhile, his personal life was no less chaotic. His wife, Helen, had grown increasingly bitter and withdrawn. Her health was deteriorating due to complications from syphilis, and she coped by drinking heavily. Gone were the days when she saw John as a reliable provider. Now she viewed him as a disappointment. Their arguments became more frequent, and Helen did not hold back in her criticisms. She mocked him for his failures, belittling his inability to hold down a job and questioning his worth as a man. For someone like John List, raised in a home where failure was not an option, Helen's words cut deep. The children, too, were changing. Patricia, his teenage daughter, was becoming more independent, expressing interest in acting and the arts, fields that John saw as frivolous and beneath his strict moral standards. He feared she was being influenced by what he considered the sinful culture of the 1970s. The idea of losing control over his family, of watching them drift away from the traditional Lutheran values he had been raised on, terrified him. In his mind, his role as the patriarch was slipping, and he saw no way to stop it. But the worst blow came from his mother, Alma. The one person in his life who had always expected nothing but perfection from him, now saw the truth. Alma had moved into the mansion with the Lists and, despite her advancing age, remained as strict and overbearing as ever. She still saw John as her little boy, the one who could do no wrong, the one who was destined for success. But now she began to sense that something was off. She questioned him about his finances, pressed him on his job situation, and subtly hinted at her disappointment. Though she never outright accused him of failure, John felt it. He felt the weight of her expectations, and it crushed him. The pressure mounted daily. Every moment was a reminder of his failures, his crumbling marriage, his rebellious children, his disappointed mother, and the relentless financial ruin. But despite all this, John refused to seek help. He was a man trapped by his own pride, paralyzed by the fear of humiliation. To him, there was only one way out. A way that, in his mind, would allow him to escape disgrace while ensuring his family's salvation. And so, a plan began to form in his mind. A dark, twisted plan that would soon turn him from a struggling man into a cold-blooded killer. John List had always been a meticulous man. He lived by routine, by order, by a sense of duty that had been drilled into him since childhood. So when he decided that the only way forward was to kill his entire family, he didn't act impulsively. No, John List planned every step with the same precision he once applied to balancing ledgers as an accountant. In his mind, this wasn't just murder. It was salvation. He convinced himself that he was saving his family from the humiliation of poverty, from a world that was growing more sinful, from a future where they might abandon their faith. And in his twisted reasoning, if he sent them to heaven, they would all be together again, free from the struggles of this life. The planning began weeks in advance. John made careful arrangements to minimize suspicion and delay discovery for as long as possible. He stopped his mail deliveries, informing the post office that the family would be traveling out of town for a few weeks. He called his children's schools, telling administrators that the kids would be away visiting relatives. He even reached out to his wife's friends, subtly planting the idea that Helen might be feeling unwell and would not be seeing visitors for a while. Next came the financial arrangements. Despite the crushing debt, John ensured that any remaining assets were liquidated, withdrawing what little money he could to sustain himself after the murders. He cashed in savings bonds and emptied his bank accounts, knowing that once he executed his plan, he would need funds to disappear. He was methodical, emotionless, treating the murders like an unpleasant but necessary business transaction. One of the most chilling details of John List's preparation was his effort to erase himself from photographs. He went through the family's photo albums and meticulously removed every picture of himself. He knew that once he vanished, the authorities would struggle to distribute images for a wanted poster. He wasn't just killing his family, he was erasing his own identity, preparing to become someone else. But perhaps the most unsettling step was his choice of weapon. John retrieved his father's old 9mm Steyr 1912 semi-automatic pistol, a relic from World War I, and paired it with his own .22 caliber revolver. He spent hours at the shooting range in the weeks leading up to the crime, ensuring he would not fail when the moment came. To John, this was not an act of rage, it was a duty, a grim responsibility that he needed to carry out with precision. Then the letters. John took the time to write a long, detailed confession addressed to his pastor. In it, he explained his reasoning, claiming that he saw no other way to save his family. He quoted scripture, twisted religious doctrine to justify his actions, and expressed hope that God would understand. The letter was not an apology, it was a rationalization, a chilling insight into the mind of a man who had convinced himself he was doing the right thing. As the days passed and the date of execution drew nearer, John continued to function as though nothing was wrong. He maintained his usual routine, attended church services, and even sat at the dinner table with his family, smiling as if everything was normal. No one suspected the horror that was about to unfold. And then, on the morning of November 9th, 1971, John List woke up knowing exactly what he was going to do. His mind was set. The plan was in place. It was time.
The morning of November 9, 1971, began like any other in the List household. The suburban home in Westfield, New Jersey, stood silent, shrouded in an eerie calm. But within its walls, John List was about to carry out the horrific plan he had meticulously crafted over the past few weeks. His wife, Helen, was his first victim. She was in the kitchen, drinking her morning coffee. Without hesitation, John approached her from behind and pulled the trigger of his 9mm Steyr pistol. The bullet struck the base of her skull, ending her life instantly. She never saw it coming, never had a moment to scream. She simply collapsed forward onto the table, her coffee cup tipping over as her lifeless body slumped in place. Next was his mother, Alma. The frail 85-year-old woman lived upstairs in a separate apartment within the house. John climbed the steps methodically, his heart hammering against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. He entered her room where she was reading her Bible, oblivious to what had just transpired downstairs. He shot her once above the left eye. Unlike Helen, he did not move her body, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps because she was not part of the same future he imagined for his wife and children in the afterlife. Instead, he left her where she sat, lifeless in her chair, her Bible slipping from her grasp. John then returned downstairs, carefully dragging Helen's body to the ballroom, a grand but rarely used part of the house. He placed her there carefully, almost reverently, as if arranging a piece of furniture rather than a corpse. Now he waited. His children, Patricia, Frederick, and John Jr., were at school. He couldn't kill them yet. That would come later. Until then, he went about the rest of his plan as if it were a normal day. He made phone calls to notify schools and work that the family would be out of town. He cleaned up the mess, wiped the blood, and made sure everything looked undisturbed. Hours passed in eerie stillness until the children returned home one by one. Patricia, his 16-year-old daughter, was the first to walk through the door. John greeted her as usual, masking the horror that had already unfolded inside. Then, in a moment of pure betrayal, he led her into the ballroom and shot her in the back of the head. Frederick, only 13, was next. The same cold, methodical approach. He never saw it coming. Finally, John Jr. arrived. His eldest son, his namesake. But something unexpected happened. Unlike the others, John Jr. did not die instantly. He fought back. He struggled, his body jerking as bullets riddled his chest. In the end, John List had to fire multiple shots to put him down, an act that was far less clinical than the others. When it was over, John Jr.'s body lay twisted on the ground, blood pooling around him, a stark contrast to the eerily neat arrangement of the others. One by one, John carefully placed his children's bodies beside their mothers in the ballroom. He covered them with sleeping bags as if tucking them in for the night. He did not cover Alma. Her fate, it seemed, was different in his mind. And then, in the stillness of the house of death, John List sat down at his desk, picked up his pen, and began writing the letter that would explain it all. The List family was gone. The house was silent. And John List was just getting started. John List stepped out of the mansion that had now become a crime scene and melted into the world without hesitation. He wasn't frantic, nor was he in a hurry. He had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. He knew exactly what he needed to do to disappear without a trace. His first stop was JFK Airport in New York, but he wasn't boarding a plane. That would be too obvious. Instead, he left his car parked in long-term parking, a decoy to mislead authorities into believing he had fled by air. From there, he took a train west, his destination unknown to anyone but himself. List had the advantage of time. Because of the careful way he executed his crime, no one would notice anything wrong for weeks. The letters he sent to the school and workplaces had ensured that no one would be suspicious of the family's sudden silence. The neighbors assumed they had gone on a trip. There was no immediate manhunt, no urgent investigation. It was as if he had planned an untraceable exit, and it worked. While authorities remained unaware of the massacre he had left behind, John List was already shedding his old identity. He altered his appearance, ditching his glasses and adopting a new hairstyle. He even went as far as changing his mannerisms, softening his rigid posture and adjusting the way he spoke. He knew that blending in was crucial. His transformation was meticulous. He obtained new documents, falsified records, and carefully rebuilt himself as a different man. Gone was the disgraced accountant from Westfield, New Jersey. In his place, a quiet, unassuming man named Robert Peter Clark emerged. For years he moved unnoticed. He took on low-profile jobs, never staying in one place too long. He knew how to avoid suspicion, how to remain just another face in the crowd. There was no social media, no databases that could instantly flag him. The technology of the time was his greatest ally. As authorities began to piece together the horrors of what had occurred inside the List mansion, John was already deeply embedded in his new life. The police found no signs of a struggle, no leads to follow. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. The murder of the List family would haunt investigators, but without a suspect in sight, without any real clues, the case started to grow cold. John List had done the unthinkable. He had murdered 5 people, walked away and vanished. And for nearly 2 decades no one would know where he was. John List had done what most criminals only dreamed of. He had disappeared entirely, stepping into a new life as Robert Peter Clark. With his old self buried along with his family, he was free to start again. He resurfaced in Denver, Colorado, where he found work as an accountant, his expertise allowing him to blend into the workforce without raising suspicion. He was methodical, choosing a modest lifestyle, avoiding luxuries that could draw attention. He kept to himself, never making unnecessary waves, never speaking about his past. But the most chilling part? He didn't just survive, he thrived. In Denver, List became a model citizen. He attended church regularly, rekindling the strict religious beliefs that had once governed his life. He socialized just enough to appear normal, yet never revealed too much. Co-workers and neighbors described him as polite, quiet, even friendly, but ultimately forgettable. That was exactly what he wanted. Then in 1985, John List, now Robert Clark, met a woman named Dolores Miller. She was a widow, kind-hearted and religious, and she saw in him a stable, dependable man. He courted her with the same old-fashioned charm he had once used on Helen. And just like before, he didn't rush. He was calculated, ensuring that he never said or did anything that might arouse suspicion. 2 years later they were married. Dolores had no idea that she had just wed a mass murderer. By now, List had perfected his deception. He was no longer an unemployed, desperate man drowning in debt. He was an accountant, a husband, a respected member of his community. He had built a second life out of the ashes of the first, and for years, it seemed like he had gotten away with it. But as much as he tried to erase his past, the world had not forgotten. Investigators never gave up, and as time passed, forensic technology and media exposure began to catch up with him. While John List lived comfortably under his false identity, his secrets were inching closer to being exposed. Little did he know, his days of freedom were numbered. His carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down in a way he never could have predicted. For nearly 2 decades, John List had successfully eluded justice. He had built a new identity, remarried, and was living a quiet, ordinary life in Richmond, Virginia. But while he had moved on, the authorities never did. His crimes were too heinous to be forgotten, and the hunt for him had never truly stopped. By the late 1980s, investigators were still haunted by the case. How could a man who had slaughtered his entire family just vanish into thin air? They had no leads, no new evidence, until they decided to try something completely different. In 1989, the case was featured on a new, widely popular television show, America's Most Wanted. The producers knew they needed something impactful to grab the audience's attention, so they worked with a forensic sculptor, Frank Bender, to create an aged bust of John List, what he might look like nearly 20 years after his disappearance. Bender meticulously crafted the sculpture, predicting how List's facial features would have changed over time, including details like sagging skin, graying hair, and even thick-framed glasses, based on his personality and habits. On May 21, 1989, the episode aired to millions of viewers across the country. The horrifying story of a man who had erased his family and disappeared resonated with the public. The show detailed his crime, his methodical escape, and the eerie possibility that he could be living among them under a different name. Then the camera zoomed in on the bust. The chillingly accurate model of John List's aged face filled television screens, searing itself into the minds of viewers. One of those viewers was a woman named Wanda Flannery. She was watching from Richmond, Virginia, and when she saw the bust, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The man on the screen looked almost identical to her neighbor, Robert Peter Clark. She had known Robert as a polite, quiet man. He was reserved, a little old-fashioned, but always respectful. Yet the resemblance was undeniable. The glasses, the shape of his face, the slightly distant stare, it was too much to ignore. Within minutes, she picked up the phone and made a call that would change everything. The past was finally catching up to John List. The phone call from Wanda Flannery set a chain of events into motion that would finally bring John List to justice. The tip was quickly relayed to the FBI, and agents wasted no time investigating the man known as Robert Peter Clark in Richmond, Virginia. At first glance, the mild-mannered accountant seemed like an unlikely fugitive. He was well-liked in his community, an active churchgoer, and lived a quiet life with his wife, Dolores. But when investigators dug deeper, they found eerie similarities to John List. His mannerisms, his habits, even the way he carried himself. The forensic bust from America's Most Wanted had been eerily accurate. Authorities set up surveillance to confirm their suspicions. They needed to be absolutely sure before making a move. 4 days they observed Clark's routine. He was meticulous, predictable, just as John List had been. The more they watched, the clearer it became. Robert Peter Clark was, without a doubt, the man they had been hunting for nearly 2 decades. On June 1, 1989, the FBI moved in. Agents arrived at his office and calmly placed him under arrest. The man who had lived freely for 18 years, undetected, now sat handcuffed, his double life crumbling before him. At first he insisted they had the wrong man. He was Robert Clark, not John List. He had never been to New Jersey, he claimed. He had never even heard of the murders. But the authorities weren't fooled. His fingerprints told a different story. When matched against the ones taken from John List before his disappearance, they were an exact match. There was no more running, no more hiding. The man who had murdered his entire family, abandoned his past, and built a new life was finally exposed. The arrest sent shockwaves through the nation. The story of John List had faded from the headlines over the years, but now it was back with a vengeance. The suburban father who had massacred his family had been hiding in plain sight all along. And now he would finally face the consequences of his crimes. But what would he say in his defense? What justification could he possibly give for such a monstrous act? As authorities prepared for his trial, the world waited for answers. With John List finally in custody, the legal system prepared to hold him accountable for the horrifying crimes he had committed nearly 2 decades earlier. His arrest had shocked the nation, but now came the moment everyone had been waiting for, his day in court. After being extradited to New Jersey, List was formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The letters he had written, the financial struggles, the premeditated manner in which he carried out the murders, everything painted a picture of a cold, calculating man who had methodically planned to kill his family. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case. They painted List as a man driven by pride and selfishness, someone who chose to destroy his family rather than face the humiliation of financial ruin. They brought forward investigators, forensic experts, and even former acquaintances who testified about his demeanor before his disappearance. The jury listened intently as the gruesome details of the crime were revisited in the courtroom. List's defense team, however, argued that he had been in a state of mental instability at the time of the murders. They claimed that his religious beliefs had played a role in his actions, that he truly believed he was saving his family from eternal damnation by killing them. Psychological experts were brought in to analyze his state of mind, but the question remained, was this enough to justify mass murder? Throughout the trial, List remained eerily composed. He rarely showed emotion, even as the prosecution presented crime scene photos and chilling details of his confession letter. But as the weight of his actions became undeniable, cracks in his cold exterior began to show. The trial captivated the public, with people across the country following the proceedings closely. After years of speculation, John List was finally being held accountable. But would the jury see him as a remorseful man who had suffered a psychological break, or as a ruthless killer who had executed his own flesh and blood to escape disgrace? As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides made their final arguments. The world waited for the verdict that would determine the fate of the man who had once vanished without a trace. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and scrutiny, the fate of John List was finally in the hands of the jury. The courtroom was silent as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The air was thick with anticipation. Would justice finally be served after nearly 2 decades? The verdict: guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the weight of the decision settled. List, who had sat expressionless through much of the trial, finally showed a flicker of emotion. Whether it was regret, fear, or resignation, no one could say for sure. But there was no escaping the reality: he would pay for his crimes. With the verdict delivered, the next step was sentencing. The prosecution pushed for the maximum punishment, arguing that List had not only premeditated the murders but had shown no remorse. They reiterated the brutality of his actions, how he had carefully planned the crime, how he had methodically executed his family members one by one, and how he had fled to live a new life while his loved ones lay lifeless in the very home they once shared. The defense, though defeated, attempted to argue for leniency. They continued to push the narrative of psychological distress, emphasizing his claimed religious motivations and financial struggles. But it was clear that these arguments carried little weight in the face of the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Finally, the judge spoke. He addressed List directly, condemning his actions in the strongest possible terms. He called the murders cold-blooded and monstrous, and emphasized that John List had robbed his family not just of their lives but of their futures. Then came the sentencing. 5 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. It was a moment of finality. For the victim's remaining relatives, for the investigators who had pursued him for years, and for the public who had followed the case with morbid fascination, justice had been served. John List would spend the rest of his life behind bars, no longer able to run from what he had done. But even with the case closed, one question lingered: did he ever truly feel remorse? As he was led out of the courtroom in shackles, the man who had once vanished into thin air was now facing the inescapable reality of his own making. With John List now behind bars, the world watched as he began the final chapter of his life, one defined not by the carefully constructed persona he had lived under for years, but by the reality of being a convicted mass murderer. Prison was a stark contrast to the quiet, structured existence List had maintained under his false identity as Robert Clark. Gone were the days of blending into the background, of working as an accountant, of living with a new wife who had no clue about his past. Now he was in a maximum security prison, surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. At first, List remained as reserved and composed as ever. He was not one to cause trouble. He followed the rules, kept to himself, and rarely spoke about the crime that had defined his existence. But despite his outwardly calm demeanor, those who studied him, psychologists, criminologists, and journalists, saw a man who still sought to justify his actions. He never truly admitted that what he did was monstrous. Instead, he clung to the idea that he had acted out of necessity, as if killing his entire family was a tragic but unavoidable decision. This refusal to fully accept responsibility frustrated many. Prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and even casual observers of the case had hoped that with time, List might express real remorse. But he never did, not in the way people wanted. He would sometimes say he regretted the pain he had caused, but he never showed deep sorrow for the lives he had taken. To him, it was a problem he had solved, in the only way he believed was possible at the time. Despite his infamy, List did not attract as much attention from other inmates as some high-profile criminals did. He was older, soft-spoken, and more reclusive than most. To many he was just another elderly prisoner serving a life sentence. Years passed and his health declined. By the early 2000s he suffered from multiple medical issues including pneumonia. In 2008 he died at the age of 82, taking with him any secrets or deeper confessions he might have had. He never sought forgiveness. He never provided any further explanations. He simply faded away, just as he had once done after committing the murders. But even in death, his story remained a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly normal life.